Chapter 1. The End. With the weight of the world on his shoulders, James was at his breaking point. This was it, rock bottom, the end of the road, and there was no light at the end of this tunnel. He was soon to be homeless and without a friend or kind acquaintance in the world. Not a single solitary soul cared for him. Every day it was getting colder and colder outside, and in a few weeks, it'll be Christmas. Happy fucking holidays. But how to do it? Overdose. Not definite enough. A knife? No, he's too much of a pussy for that, and he'd be the first one to admit it. Jump? No, he's absolutely terrified of heights. Gun? No, don't have one nor the money to buy it. Drowning? Now, there's an idea. He loved the water, he would just have to jump in and simply not swim back. And just like that, he had his plan. He drove to a nearby park with a lake, one he had fished at many times before. There were plenty of good memories here, but rather than offer comfort or contentment, the memories all just seemed to poke and prod at him, jabbing him with sharp, mocking blows to his already sensitive constitution. None of these good times were ever going to be had again, and that thought made the sad, sorrowful pit in his heart grow even deeper. He walked to the edge of the water, fully clothed, and took in a deep, shaky breath. As he exhaled, looking out over the serene water, he lost all composure. Floodgates holding back an immeasurable amount of pain and sadness snapped under the weight of the moment. Tears flowed like a river in a rainstorm, rushing down his cheeks and clinging to his chin before making a detour down his neck and pooling in the neck of his t-shirt. In just minutes he could feel the wetness on his chest, though he hadn't yet put one foot in the water. His life was replaying over in his mind. He saw every good time, everyone he had ever loved, his accomplishments and all the obstacles he had ever overcome. He also saw every mistake, every time he had ever been hurt, every loss, all his failures and the challenges standing in front of him. To him these challenges were inscalable mountains, and he was about as prepared and capable to overcome them as if he was stark naked. The night was still, silent, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water all around him. Suddenly the quiet was broken by a sound so indescribable that if heard, the listener would not believe that it was from this earth. The sound was piercing, yet guttural, terrifying yet sorrowful. It cracked and broke but continued on for an inhuman amount of time. A soul-shaking howl from the deepest, blackest pits of hell, the very cries of the damned. James felt as if his spirit might actually leave his body as he screamed into the night. He screamed until he couldn't scream anymore, his throat choked and hoarse until he was overtaken by a violent coughing fit. With no will of strength, the spasms brought James to his knees, doubled over, struggling to regain composure. New thoughts begin rolling into the forefront of his mind as he gets acquainted with the damp, rocky ground. All the plans he had, things he hasn't done, places he's never been, and goals not yet achieved. Such a waste, came a voice from the far left corner of his mind. It was so crisp and clear that it took James by complete surprise, and he whipped around to see if it had not actually been another person. He looked pitiful there, crumpled up on the ground, face all red and wet with dirt spattered and stuck on one side, but there was no one there. He was utterly alone. He reached out and put a hand into the water. It was cold, but he was already so numb that it didn't bother him like it would on a normal, happier day. It's time, he thought, and stood up. He took in a sharp breath and let it out just as quick, and then took a step. He felt cold water making its way through various pathways into his shoe, took a moment to adjust, and then took another step. He continued on his death march, slowly and methodically, letting his body acclimate with each step. When he was about waist deep, he had to fight the urge to turn tail and run out of the freezing cold, as the shock in that area was the worst so far. He actually took a few steps back to shore out of sheer physical reaction, but stopped himself when he remembered he had nothing to go back to. Sadly, he returned to his previous spot, waist deep in the water. This new level of despair hardened him until he found himself chest deep in the water. Just a couple more steps to go. It will all be over soon. But how soon? He didn't quite think through that he would be left alone with his thoughts as he waited for the sweet release of death by voluntary drowning. He decided to swim. Physical activity has a way of making the mind go blank and focus on the moment. He swam around clumsily with his shoes and clothing on, splashing himself and taking on water by accident. He hadn't actually been trying to drown himself this moment, just swim around a bit to shut his mind up. He got frustrated with himself quickly. His mind was racing at about 1 million thoughts per second and diving deep down an infinite number of outcomes. Whereas the only unifying factor amongst them was that every single one was truly terrible. Imagine the slow agonizing torture of your own mind eating and chipping away at you from every angle until there's nothing left but deep, sad emptiness. Self-destruction can be the only answer for one so horrifically inane. He dunked his head under the freezing water and did not have immediate intentions to return to the surface. He felt the strain on his lungs as oxygen was quickly being whisked away at a cellular level. With his last shred of will, he fought his instincts and let his last breath escape. He felt his heartbeat rock his insides, and then the emptiness in his chest began filling with ice-cold water. As the shock of the water in his chest hit him, his body reacted violently. He began choking and coughing and thrashing about, all without rising to the surface. Emotions and circumstances be damned now, the body is programmed to live and survive. His body enters into full panic mode. Completely unable to form an intelligible thought, he simply reacts. He throws out his arms and legs and scrambles, desperately groping in open water for footholds that are not there. With every second passing by, more and more water enters his lungs and more precious oxygen is burned up inside his cells. His brain scrambles through thoughts like a slot machine trying to put two and two together. Suddenly, a voice broke through the haze. This time, James knew it was not his own, but there it was, clear as a bell inside his own head, and he was not in a state to question anything at the present moment. Something had reached out, across the ether, and answered James' soul cry for help. The voice only said one word, but it was loud, clear, and he understood what to do at once. Up, it said. James' body understood and obeyed the command immediately. He scrambled to the surface with unearthly haste. That first breath of air after emerging from his would-be watery tomb was akin to the first breath taken when exiting the womb, painful, terrifying, exhilarating, and life-changing. He would never know appreciation for life like this again. He struggled against the water in his lungs and the lack of oxygen in his blood, but ultimately managed to flail his way back to shore. He lay there, ungracefully sprawled out on the ground, coughing and choking at the water's edge, almost exactly as he had been not 30 minutes before. Feeling utterly helpless and pathetic, he decided to stay there on the ground, hoping he'd pass out and freeze to death in his sleep. If only it were that easy. Moments before drifting off into oblivion, the voice came again, and again it was too sharp, too clear, too loud and too outside of himself. James' eyes shot open and his head spun around, looking for the source of the voice, but still, no one was there. "Get inside," it said. "It is not your time. There is much left to do before you go."